Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 122. Tony and Thargeen, Part 5. Tony was actually impressed. The folks they'd sort of shanghaied for the old stuff is going down and your help is needed talk had kept it together pretty well. Oh, there had been suspicion, muttering, and very pointed looks doing the rounds, followed by more than a touch of wide-eyed horror because alien invasion. But they all seemed to get that this was dead serious and in earnest. There hadn't been a single case of someone getting all up in someone else's face due to religion, race, sex, country of origin, or any other stupid difference. Given some of the attendees, that was a heck of an accomplishment. But what was really impressive was the geeks among the bunch. And make no mistake, there were geeks in every bunch, not just among the astronaut and astronaut wannabes. They'd all managed to hold it together fairly well to the end. There'd been a whole heck of a lot of wide eyes, odd expressions, and various hastily stifled noises of excitement, but they'd stayed in their seats and had more or less maintained at least some vague sense of dignity. Thargeen's offer of sanctuary on Svartalfheim sort of broke the dam, as it were. It was a generous and absolutely necessary, at least for some, offer. That wasn't the problem. No, the problem was that the geeks had managed to keep their stuff together while talking about a threat to Earth, but the offer of a chance to hang out on an alien planet with real-life aliens? Yeah, that nearly started a riot. Tony was kind of shocked. No one resorted to literally knocking down and climbing over anyone else in their eagerness to accept the offer. There had been excited squealing and bouncing involved. Granted, Tony had done his own excited squealing and bouncing, so we couldn't laugh at them too hard. Though he did snicker at that handful that looked like they just might faint. Some of the folks who mobbed Thargeen were, though, in earnest about needing a place to go when, not if, their country went ape. China in particular, with its restrictive politics and policies, were very, very likely to throw a tantrum at its people acting without their government's say-so. Russia probably wouldn't be too much better, really. They might have a democracy now, but the old politics and policies still lingered. The other countries might get pissy, but they were a lot less likely to declare their people traitors to be shot on sight or the like. Tony, Thargeen, and Pal Thor had worked together on the plans necessary to smuggle families out of the danger zone so they couldn't be used against any of the would-be participants in the defense of Earth. Tony had rather obviously been in charge of making it, so the others knew who to pick up. It wasn't SI's usual bailiwick, but they did have a presence either in each of the 12 countries or in a country close enough to get across the border. The families would all get smuggled away from their homes to somewhere safer, mostly SI properties, though American embassies would also be used if they were more easily reachable. Once the families were on safe turf, the crew could teleport them onto the ship that'd be transporting everyone to Svartalfheim. Thargeen, obviously, had been the one to offer to house folks, at least temporarily. Those that couldn't handle living underground, something they had no way of figuring out beforehand, would go to Vanaheim when that became clear. Pal Thor had offered to use one of Vanaheim's troop transports for the job of transporting everyone. The dwarves, who didn't go for land wars for the most part, didn't really have transports big enough to hold that many people. And even if they did, there was the height issue. The rooms in the ships were big enough. Dwarves, despite being short, appreciated a lot of space both vertically and horizontally when they could get it. The furniture wouldn't be the right size, though. Since the trip to Svartalfheim would take about a week, the troop transports were significantly slower than the small, fast ship that Thargeen and co. had arrived in. That was a major problem. Jarvis had, when they'd screened possible recruits, tracked down where those people's immediate families lived. Now, as each confirmed their willingness to throw down on Earth's behalf, Jarvis would be contacting the SI facility closest to the endangered families. Those facilities had all been forewarned that a security crew and transport truck would be needed, and were currently on standby. Those folks would be tucked away safely within the next 4 hours at the most. The transport from Vanaheim would be arriving within 10 hours. An hour after that, everyone involved would be off-planet and out of the reach of tetchy governments. Thargeen handled the sudden mob pretty well. There was a moment of wide-eyed oh crap, but he rallied fast and soon had everyone all but literally eating out of his hand. Tony figured the fact he didn't act like a rooty, snooty, better-than-you royal helped a lot. Despite being a king, Thardine came off as an everyday working man. Tony had no idea if that was just him or what. Bestla had been similarly down to earth, so it could either be personalities or species differences. Even pal Thor and Frigga, for all they had put on the elves' superior airs, couldn't really be mistaken for anything but royalty. Thardine wasn't the only one getting mobbed either. Thardine got the lion's share of the squealing geeks and the folks that legitimately needed sanctuary on Svartalfheim. Razdan and Campana were fielding a good-sized chunk of the rest. Most of whom, from what Jarvis was translating, were deeply interested in schematics of the ships and in comparing battle strategies. Fortunately, Razdan had some schematics on hand. Part of the reason the dwarves would be able to build 10 ships in a year was that they weren't starting from scratch. They were using a pre-existing template for ships they'd built for Vanaheim. Ships from that realm had been picked for 2 reasons. Firstly, Vanaheim had far less of a problem with magic and long-distance weaponry than Asgard did, and their ship designs reflected that. Vanaheim ships were less troop transport, though they did have those, and more battleship than Asgardian ships. Thanks to the occasional dragon invasions, which, seriously? Dragons? The ships were also loaded for bear. Secondly, the average height for Vanaheim natives was roughly 3 inches taller than the average height for U.S. citizens. All the other realms had a 6-inch or more average difference, with dwarves being markedly shorter while everyone else was taller. The smaller height difference meant less adjustments. The height of most seats, control panels, and the like wouldn't have to be adjusted at all. The adjustments required for other things would be only minimal, like how wide a control panel could be to have all the buttons and switches be comfortably reachable from a seated position. Of course, the actual controls themselves would be much simplified, but that was an entirely different discussion. From the expansive, expressive gestures going on in the group around Campana, including Campana herself, a great time was being had by all in that group. Again, thanks to the choice of who to invite to this shindig, there wouldn't be a massive alteration in the humans' already established thought patterns, strategies, and tactics. They'd probably not be as effective as the purpose-trained crews of the other realms, but given the time crunch they were dealing with, they were the best Earth had to offer. Midgardians, Thardine decided, were extremely entertaining. And he did not mean that in a condescending way. He had understandably assumed that Tony Stark was unique among his kind. In a way, he was. From what Thardine had learned in the last few days, no one else on Midgard even came close to Tony's abilities with Midgardian technology. But in other ways, Tony seemed to be utterly normal. Midgardians, for the most part, seemed to be driven in a way that the other realm residents, even the dwarves, had long since lost. Oh, his people were in better shape than the rest. But even the dwarves had, over time, lost a great deal of their drive to discover, invent, and create new groundbreaking things right this very moment. They still did all 3, but on a much longer time scale than they once had. That drive made Midgardians almost wholly unpredictable, because to someone used to living for millennia, they jumped from thing to thing with no apparent rhyme or reason. It was utterly confounding, even to Thardine, but he at least could appreciate and tolerate it. Some of the other realm rulers weren't so lucky. Thardine got a lot of amusement out of hearing the confounded mutterings of the ones who just couldn't seem to keep up. Salar, in particular, had been comedy gold since Tony's visit to Elfheim. It was all but unheard of for someone to beat an elf at their own game, and Tony had done so with, from what Thardine had heard, at great length, at any rate, little to no effort. Kavlos, the elf's general, had been only marginally less entertaining than Salar had been. Kavlos, at least, had simply been confused as to how such a short-lived species could have gotten so far as they had, and be able to keep up with the longer-lived realm residents, especially given elvish prejudices, since Midgardians had no magic. Though apparently Tony and Loki had contrived to make it look like Tony at least had magic. Salar had been half a step from having a full-on, legitimate, childish temper tantrum over Tony's antics. Mostly the bit where Tony had the utter gall to dismiss Sarlar as unimportant and bypass him for Kavlos, which, at least in this instance, Sarlar was actually unimportant, thanks entirely to how the elves had divided their society. It was the dark elves that fought, not the light ones. While Sarlar controlled when they were allowed to do so, beyond saying, "Have at it," he had no part in the war effort. That was left to the elves who knew how to wage war. This bunch of Midgardians was entertaining in a different way. While some of them were able to stay calm and reasonable, most of the ones that had approached him were comparable to an overly excited toddler presented with a new, much-desired toy. Tony's reactions to dwarvish craft and abilities had been amusing enough on Svartalfheim. These folks were squealing and bouncing over just the existence of so-called aliens and spaceships, even without having actually seen the latter. Thorgane was very hard put to keep from laughing at their antics. That said, despite their overexcited demeanors, many of them were still able to ask intelligent, insightful questions. Things like the differences between Svartalfheim's atmosphere and gravity and Midgard's, which, if they were different enough, like with Jotunheim, would present difficulties in living on the realm for Midgardians. Nothing the Midgardians couldn't compensate for, but they needed to know before they could do so. Thankfully, Svartalfheim, while different, was not nearly so different from Midgard as Jotunheim was, so there was no need for specialist equipment of any kind to live there. The living underground would actually be the greatest challenge if the reactions of other realm residents were anything to go by. Beings used to seeing the sun and sky every day tended to have a time of it adjusting to living underground. Right about the time the worst of the crush was easing and the talk was starting to turn to more trivial matters, like what sort of life forms other than dwarves called Svartalfheim home, Tony gave Thorgane a thumbs up, then stepped forward. "Alright, everyone pipe down for a second," Tony called, and to Thorgane's surprise, got the quiet he asked for. "Everyone that's asked for sanctuary, your immediate families, meaning living grandparents, parents, siblings, their spouses and kids, your spouses and kids, are all now on SI properties and being kept safe. A transport ship will be arriving within about 6 hours to take them all to Svartalfheim, along with those of you who will be assisting with the building of the ships," Tony told them. "Those of you who plan on being ship crews, a dozen Vanaheim battleships will be arriving with the transport, so you can get a gander and also help the Vanaheim crews familiarize themselves with our solar system," Tony continued. "Dwarvish crews and ships will be arriving the day after to familiarize themselves with the solar system. The future ship crews will head for Svartalfheim in a few weeks' time. Until then, you'll be living on a second Vanaheim troop transport that will be in orbit around Mars." Well out of reach of anyone on Midgard at this time, Thorgane knew. This is due to the rest of the realms sending their own space fleet representatives over the next week to familiarize themselves with the system. Well, the rest of the realms that had fleets and used them to make war, that was. Which was down to the elves and Asgardians, since Jotunheim had no fleet at all, and the Nidavellir had only a small fleet that hadn't been used since Thanos had been driven from the realms. At least not for making war. Some of the fleet, the transports, had been converted to trade ships, allowing the Nidavellir to obtain what few things they could not make themselves without having to step foot on another realm. Even those converted trade ships were seldom used, making perhaps one trip a decade or so. The few remaining warships would be crewed and brought to the fight, but it would take longer than for the other realms, as the Nidavellir were more or less having to relearn how to work those ships. There was a collective sigh of relief from the folks who had been most serious about requiring sanctuary, followed quickly by a renewal of the excited chatter from earlier over meeting yet more aliens and getting to poke about on their spaceships and live in space, even if only for a few days. The folks here were safe enough for the next few hours until the transports arrived. Thorgane watched as Tony pointed everyone in the direction of refreshments and the facilities they would need to create blueprints or access any other necessary information from Midgard's computers and or internet.